What up everyone, Mr. Stewart here, welcome to Mr. Stewart's History Revision channel. Today I'm going to be teaching about the Cold War in Europe, in particular the USSR that Mikhail Gorbachev inherited. We will start straight after this. Peace. Okay, so before we look at Gorbachev himself, we need to look at the people that were in power before him, in particular Andropov, 1982 to 1984, and Konstantin Chernenko in 1984 till 1985. Now these two leaders were in power of the USSR when it was really in its decline, which is very, very significant, because that is the USSR that Gorbachev inherited. So let's have a little look about. Let's have a little look at the man himself. Mikhail Gorbachev's full name is Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. He was born March 2nd, 1931, in a place called Stavropol in the southwestern region of the USSR. Okay, of Russia. Sorry. In 1952, he actually entered law school of Moscow State University and became a member of the Communist Party here. And he graduated from this university in law in 1955. He became the first secretary of the regional party committee in 1970 and was made a central committee member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1971. And he became the Secretary of Agriculture in 1978. So he was really making a lot of prominence and ascension in the Communist Party. In particular, the Politburo. The Politburo in 1979 made him a full member by 1980, and the Politburo basically was an organisation that created the policies for the Communist Party. And eventually he became the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, mainly because of his experience in the Politburo, and he was the youngest member of the Politburo, even as the leader of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That's the man himself, okay? Sitting there in front of a camera. Not on his chair. I think he might have been sitting on a stool. Okay, Gorbachev and the situation he inherited. He inherited a USSR that basically was on the decline. And these are the three things that he inherited that he believed he needed to improve if the USSR was going to remain a world power. The first of which was the Soviet economy stagnating. He believed it needed import from the West, which was not a great thing because the West were not communist. They were the type of people that were not inclined to trade with a country that did not believe in capitalism. The USSR was also suffering from global overstretch. So global overstretch is when a country of significant power takes on more global responsibilities than they can actually maintain. And finally, the other situation that Gorbachev inherited was a collapse of Detente in the late 1970s between the USA and USSR, which created an expensive arms race that the USSR could not maintain, and also the USSR under Yuri Andropov made some significant mistakes. To tackle all of this, Gorbachev launched three things: modernization of the USSR, renewal of Detente, and the ending of the Cold War. Not the Cold War, the Cold War. But what he didn't realise was that all of his actions would eventually lead to the collapse of the USSR. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each three of the situations that Gorbachev inherited one by one, look at them in a little bit more detail, and then we're going to come back at the end and set you up for the next video, which will be all about Gorbachev and his attempt to fix the situation that he inherited. Okay, so number one, the Soviet economy was stagnating and needed input from the West. So, Mikhail Gorbachev believed that the USSR could no longer go on how they were living. And the economy, the problem, the situation they inherited can be depicted by three graphs. Now, each of those three graphs we're going to look at in a little bit more detail so that we understand the economy that Gorbachev inherited a little bit more. So the economy that Gorbachev inherited was one that did not have a significant average output of new oil wells. It was declining in its production of oil, which is significant, because it means it was losing its place in the energy market. The countries that relied on it for energy would begin to look elsewhere if they could not maintain the need for oil, the need for energy that was put upon them. And as you can see, there's a significant drop in a percentage of average output of oil wells from 1975 to when Gorbachev took power in the late 1980s. So oil depreciation was significant with the USSR that Gorbachev inherited, which greatly affected the economy because they were not getting the money that they were getting prior to 1975. The Soviet food situation was a big effect on the economy that Gorbachev inherited because Russia itself, as you can see with all the minuses, did not have sufficient production to maintain its population's food needs. It relied heavily on the other countries in the USSR. However, their production was grinding to a lower yield. And as you can see with all the minuses, that means that they themselves did not have enough food to maintain their own populations. So they didn't have enough meat, didn't have enough milk, didn't have enough grain, potatoes or vegetables. And if those countries didn't have enough, they are not going to be inclined to then ship off food to Russia, who relied on these nations for their food. That's why they were one of the reasons why they're part of the USSR, to maintain their population in Russia. And those countries were unable to maintain the food production that was needed from the USSR. And this was a big effect on the economy because that meant that the money that was buying these products was not being spread out properly. And when those countries feel like they could not maintain the food production that Russia was expecting of them, you're going to end up having a rebellion. You're going to end up having people going against the USSR, which is not something that Gorbachev wanted, but it is something that he inherited. The final part, the final graph, when it comes to the USSR's economy that Gorbachev inherited, is the rise and fall of the economy as a whole. Now, as you can see, the GDP was below that of the USA right from 1946, but it did begin to rise, and it was a steady incline. However, it begins to plateau in the early 1980s and late 1970s, which is basically not good for the USSR. That means their economy is beginning to falter. And as you can see, in 1990, it does begin to depreciate drastically. Gorbachev needed to change things in the USSR, otherwise the USSR, the Soviet economy, would completely collapse, which would have been catastrophic for the superpower. Gorbachev needed to sort this out and promptly. And he was thinking maybe investment from the West would be what could be the thing to improve the economy. The second thing that Gorbachev inherited was basically a USSR that was suffering from global overstretch. Now, if you remember, I told you what global overstretch was. Global overstretch is a power that is taking on more global responsibilities than they can handle. That is what global overstretch is. Okay? More responsibilities than they can handle. So, we've got a number of countries there where they believe that they could intervene and they could help and support those regions. Now, all of those regions were nations that had pro-Soviet powers in place. So we've got Latvia 1986. Now, Latvia 1986, at the time when Gorbachev came into power, he inherited a Latvia that had just had a significant protest. The working class in Latvia held a march where they demanded that the Soviet Union would leave Latvia and give them their independence. So what did the Soviet Union do? They fired on the protesters and killed some of them, which caused outroar in Latvia. Gorbachev inherited that. Kazakhstan in 1986. Protests began here with a few hundred university students, but escalated to thousands of students protesting in the streets, and the Soviet government ordered troops to disperse all of the crowds. Thousands of students were arrested, and approximately 200 were killed by Soviet troops. Again, something Gorbachev inherited. Estonia, 1987. 1987. The protests in Estonia went across the country. Many newspapers began publishing articles. People were saying that Estonia should be an independent nation and break free from the Soviet Union. Again, this is something that Gorbachev inherited because the USSR were not doing what they should have been doing. They were not maintaining the economy correctly. So when he gained power in 1955, this is what he was bombarded with. Latvia, 1986. Kazakhstan, right, 1986. Estonia, 1987. Armenia, 1987 again. Protesters marched and complained about how a Soviet chemical factory was polluting a lake and how a Soviet nuclear power plant was polluting their air. They were not happy being part of the USSR. Ukraine, 1988. Thousands of protesters fighting against communist rule. Gorbachev had to deal with these issues straight away. The USSR was suffering from global overstretch. 1980s, throughout the 1980s, Poland was basically a communist country where its leaders, they were not listening properly and taking direction properly. There were many protests, however, that emerged demanding that Poland abandon its communist government. During 1988, there were strikes that hurt Poland's economy, forcing its government to start negotiating with solidarity movement protesters. Gorbachev was inheriting the USSR, suffering from global overstretch, which meant that they were not going to be able to maintain the Soviet Union. We're not going to keep it going. Trying to get involved in issues 1975 to 1988 in Angola and in Ethiopia. Let's take Angola, for example. In Angola, 1975, they were going through a civil war, and the USSR didn't want the USA to have significant influence in Africa. So what they decided to do when Angola civil war began, they decided that they were going to intervene, and they were going to send a Cuban intervention with 12,000 Cuban troops being transported by the USSR along with tanks, missiles. By 1975, the Cubans had halted the Civil War itself, and they advanced and inflicted 2 defeats on the UNITA movement. UNITA movement. The only reason why this was basically allowed to happen is because the US didn't want to get into another basically war, another proxy war like Vietnam. By March 1976, the MPLA, which was backed by a communist USSR, were victorious. They triumphed, and it seemed that this confirmed that newly independent states, the developing world, were ready to embrace Soviet style of communism. However, a number of crises developed from their influence in Angola and in Ethiopia because they were so stretched. Their money and their resources were so stretched they couldn't maintain properly their union in Europe itself. So this is what Gorbachev inherited. And these are the things that he had to deal with straight away. Okay. Moving on to our next one. Gorbachev inherited a USSR that was led by Yuri Andropov. Now, Yuri Andropov, although he was in power for a short amount of time, he did have some significant influence on the USSR that Gorbachev inherited. Now, it all stems from when Brezhnev died in 1982, November 1982. Yuri Andropov came into power. Now, when this happened, roughly a year later, Reagan, the President of the United States, announced that he was going to be implementing a Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, also known as Star Wars. I did speech marks with my fingers there. Not Star Wars is in Star Wars the film. Star Wars is in wars that will be fought in the skies. The Strategic Defense Initiative was planned to be an anti-ballistic missile shield composed of nuclear missiles and laser-armed satellites that will protect the USA from attack, in turn making the USSR's arms irrelevant, obsolete, and would make them vulnerable to attack by the USA. This basically depleted the USSR's position as an equal world power as the USA. This was all under Yuri Andropov. This was a USSR that Gorbachev inherited. Also, under Yuri Andropov, the USSR made a mistake. The USSR increased the tensions, again increasing the tensions with the USA. Things just got better with Detente. But now it's got worse again because, unfortunately, a Soviet fighter aircraft destroyed a South Korean passenger aircraft. Now remember, the South Koreans were supported by the USA and North Korea was supported by the USSR. So a Soviet fighter aircraft destroyed a South Korean passenger aircraft which had flown into Soviet airspace. The USSR refused to accept any responsibility, which led to Reagan describing the incident as an act of unprecedented barbarism. Andropov responded that his government felt that it could no longer do business with the USA. In November 1983, relations were so poor that Andropov feared that an annually scheduled NATO military exercise might be a cover for a nuclear attack on the USSR. Andropov made a drastic mistake which affected the USSR's economy, which was to say that they could no longer do business with the USA. Things were just beginning to improve. And Andropov made the mistake of going backwards, 100 steps backwards, to pre-Detente, to pre-Ostpolitik. That is the USSR that Gorbachev inherited. That is the USSR that Gorbachev needed to improve. So what did Gorbachev do? Gorbachev introduced a new Detente. Gorbachev introduced Glasnot. An attempt to improve the USSR, to improve relations with USA, to end the Cold War once and for all, and to modernize the USSR. But again, what he didn't realize is he would be the reason why the USSR would collapse. He didn't realize this. Next session, we will look at the things that Gorbachev implemented into the USSR that fought against the USSR that he inherited. I'm Mr. Stewart. I will see you again soon. I hope you had a good time. See you in the next video. Peace.